The views expressed on the Final Straw Radio do not necessarily reflect those of Asheville FM, Friends of Community Radio, or any of the affiliate radio stations airing the show. Airing first on WSFM LP 103.3 in Asheville, North Carolina, this is The Final Straw, and I'm Bursa Goodness. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net. If you're interested in rebroadcasting any episode or segment, you're free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. You can find radio-friendly versions of this show of 59 minutes in length by visiting archive.org and searching for the collection called The Final Straw Radio. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw, care of Asheville FM, 864 Haywood Road, Asheville, North Carolina, 28806. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee, located at 610 Haywood Road. Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog of books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop.
This week is the 25th anniversary of the longest prison uprising in U.S. history in which lives were lost. The rebellion, which lasted 11 days, took place at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility, more commonly known as Lucasville, in April 1993. The disturbance broke out on L Block, which housed over 400 people. Over the course of the uprising, one correction officer being held hostage and 9 prisoners were killed. The most immediate cause for the riot was a group of Muslim prisoners' refusal to take a tuberculosis test, which was going to be administered in a form that would have violated their religious beliefs. But serious grievances had simmered under the surface at Lucasville for many years, and ultimately the prisoners' demands far exceeded Muslims' opposition to TB shots, addressing concerns about conditions of confinement held by the entire inmate population. After 11 days, a negotiated surrender ended the siege. Prisoners gave up control of L Block in return for the state's concession to a 21-point plan responding to their demands. Afterwards, authorities engaged in widespread retaliation, including the targeting of 5 individuals who were perceived as leaders for capital offenses. To this day, the Lucasville Five, as they are called, sit on death row for murders that numerous investigations have proved they did not commit. To reflect on the Lucasville Uprising 25 years later, Disembodied Voice spoke with 2 individuals who were involved in the event in very different ways. First, we hear from Mozi Paki, who was present on L Block during the rebellion and served 19 years, most of it in isolation, after the siege ended. We will then hear from attorney Nicky Schwartz, who represented prisoners during their negotiation of the 21-point plan that ended the siege of Lucasville.
Stay tuned to the end of the show for some announcements. Also, you should check out our podcast special from yesterday with an update on the eviction of the ZAD in Notre-Dame-des-Landes in western France, the giant land occupation that was set up to block an airport from being built. And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We're caught like a ball!
Terrorism used to be defined as acts taken to instill fear in a population with the aim of coercing a change in social policy. In my lifetime, that definition has changed, and terrorism now is defined as generally any action undertaken by humans in an effort to alter the exercise of power. Even standing on the sidewalk outside of a cosmetics lab is now an act of terror. Tersely worded complaints to lawmakers can get you surveilled for life as a potential terrorist. We live in an age where grumbling is terrorism. But at the same time, we have also diminished what constitutes terrorism when it comes to state actors. While everything we do as humans is now understood by the state as potential acts of terror, we now very narrowly define hardly anything that states do as terror. Sure, we recognize Bashir al-Assad's barrel bombs of nerve gas as state terror, but hardly anything else. We don't consider all the subtle ways in which states terrorize us. As I am fond of pointing out, nation-states are equipped with Apache attack helicopters. These helicopters are pretty mobile. They can point that way, or they can point this way. You bought that helicopter, paid for every single component, from the rotor to the gun barrels. So in the event that things get hectic and the Apache attack helicopter gets pointed at you, You can ponder the irony as you duck for cover that you paid for those shells. But apart from the literal Apache attack helicopters, we're also up against a lot of figurative ones. Police squad cars are some figurative Apache attack helicopters, particularly in the black community. Prisons and jails also cast a looming shadow. In that sense, there really is a vast state terror apparatus imposed on all of us, all the time. Maybe not as spectacular as barrel bombs and nerve gas, but maybe more effective over the long haul. Consider the whole point of terrorism, state terrorism or otherwise. It's to alter the conduct of those being terrorized. Think of all the ways that these subtle terrors influence our behaviors. Think about the talk that parents must have with their black children about police and how to conduct themselves in an incredibly cautious way in order to avoid getting shot and killed. Think about how that constant threat, the looming shadow of that proverbial Apache attack helicopter, influences behaviors. All of those images of gun-happy cops gunning down unarmed black men year after year, month after month, day after day, it instills a climate of constant fear, anxiety, and apprehension. It potentially stops black people particularly from doing what they otherwise might do in confronting police or protesting or any other form of visible expression that might involve confronting police with guns. The use of so-called terrorism enhancements by the state to punish mundane activities like protesting on public sidewalks, imposing 20-year sentences for peaceful behavior, is designed to alter our conduct. It's designed not just to compel us out of fear to go along with the program, but also to impose a virtually new program. And it works. We do less. We say less. State terror is very effective. In my own experience recently, state terrorists apprehended me and removed me from population, once again targeting my communication to the outside world. In emails sent out for posting, I described how prison officials engaged in a criminal conspiracy to steal my incoming mail from the courts, theft of mail designed to prevent me from effectively suing the very prison officials stealing my mail. In emails, I directed free world people as to whom they should call to complain. State terrorists, targeting my outgoing communications, decided to put me in segregation on the ridiculous pretext that calling prison officials fart goblins constituted disrespect to prison employees. So now, unflattering commentary about state terrorists is the same as unflattering commentary to state terrorists. I had to go 10 days on a hunger strike to resolve the disciplinary frame-up in a way that I can still drop in security in July to obtain programs and maybe someday get a parole. And still, my email access has been suspended, which was not part of the resolution. Very possibly, state terrorists will simply pull the plug on any of my communications mediums. I now face the constant threat that anything I say to anyone may offend the state terrorists who will again, and again and again, subject me to successive minor terrors and the threat of extended imprisonment, simply for telling the truth. I have to wonder, in what ways have the state terrorists influenced my own commentary? How much of my word choice, how much of the decision-making about the topics I choose to address is shaped in even unconscious ways by the ever-present threat of deprivations and brutality by my lawless captors and their criminal agenda? To what degree am I compromised by the fear of subtle terrors? That, I think, is the really insidious part of it all. Not only do we not conduct ourselves as free people, but we ourselves do not even know to what degree we have self-censored our own words and conduct. To what extent have we cut out our own tongues and amputated our own fingers, conforming to the expectations of those state terrorists who cast that looming shadow of their Apache attack helicopter over our lives? State terror works. Sucks to be us. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain from Warren Correctional in Lebanon, Ohio. If you're listening,
you can write to Sean Swain at Sean Swain 243-205 Warren CI, P.O. Box 120, 5787 State Route 63, Lebanon, Ohio, 45036. Updates on his situation and more writings by Sean can be found at seanswain.org.
So we're really glad to be talking with Mozi Paki today. Mozi, I understand that you were present at Lucasville during the rebellion. Is that right?
Yes, I was. I was in L1.
And how long before the rebellion had you been at OCFS?
I got to, they call it SOCF, Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. But everybody around there and the inmates call it Lucasville because it's in the so-called Lucasville city where all the guards stay. I got to SOCF 1990. I can't remember exact date or month, but it was in the fall.
So it had been about 3 years before the rebellion?
Yes, I was there 3 years prior to the siege, yes.
If you could just talk a little bit about your experience up until the rebellion, what the conditions were like, and if you feel like anything that you saw or experienced while you were there had an impact on the uprising.
When I got there, I was initially held in lockdown because they sent me there because they said I attempted to escape from another institution. And then when they said I wasn't a threat and I was okay to go in population, assigned me to L1. And out there, COs, I saw 5 of them. They had inmate handcuffed and ankle shackled and dragging him down the hallway. 2 had his one ankle, each CO had his one ankle, and the other 3 were kicking him. And I was like, wow. So when I got there, I soon learned that this is Southern Ohio. It's right on the Ohio River. And most of the inmates are from Northern Ohio or Central Ohio. I learned that there were a lot of racial overtones there between inmates, black inmates, and the guards. And they had an Aryan nation, but you had very little organization, or so I should say, other activities, like you had Muslims, you had other people that had little cliques, they hung out together and things like that. But it was what you call a max institution. And there were 8 blocks on A side as well as 8 blocks on K side. And I believe what led up to the uprising or the riot or the siege, they were trying to force black and Aryans to cell together. And of course, the Aryans didn't want that. And then on the other side, they were trying to, what they always did, try to get this TB shots to inmates. And a sect of the Muslims were against it. And the other Muslims were against it also, but for different reasons. One sect was against the shots because they said that it had alcohol base in it. The group of Muslims that I was with were against it because we found out that the shots for TB would be out of the refrigeration unit overnight, which means they were not kept cool at the time of shooting, and there's always something that can happen, a side effect. And we were all trying to get the swab. And it was various things going on, and it was just a lot of stabbings, assaults, and a couple of weapons had been found, and bullets on the yard. But I think a lot of it was based around the cell arrangement and the tuberculosis shot.
Something that I've always been curious about is, from what I understand, the intention was not to take over the whole prison beforehand. It was more something that one thing led to another, is how I understand.
My understanding between the Muslims that I were associated with were that we were going to refuse the shots. and request that we take a swab or whatever, anything other than shots. The other sect, they were totally against the shot because they said they had alcohol bases, and they were refusing the shots. And I'm not sure exactly what their intentions were, but everyone seemed to be along the lines of just staying in the cells and refusing to take the shots. But now I can admit this. There were a lot of abusive things being done by the guards there. For instance, this one guy had a parole, and he was 2 weeks from going home, toward going home. They locked him in the segregation, and they said that he hung himself. They come to find out they beat him to death.
And was there ever any kind of accountability for that?
No, not at all. There was a lot of different stuff that COs were involved in as far as like drugs and any and everything else to make money. And
before the Muslim folks decided that they were going to refuse the shot, I understand there were some negotiations with the warden, with the administration prior to that, before they kind of said, okay, well, we have to just refuse the shot. There was a negotiation that had broken down, correct?
Yes, my understanding that there was conversation between the warden, assistant warden, as well as the group that I was with also. And they said that they would try to appease us, but at that point in time, they would not change their alleged plans of giving out the shots. And so it was also said to them that if you're going to administer the shots, we will not take them in our cells, because that means you got to bring the shots to the cells, and they would stay in these on this table for so many hours from one block to another one, and they would lose potency and everything else, and give the shots on another type of basis, that were not made of the same assumption they had the alcohol basis. But I wasn't in on all the talks, and my understanding was some of the talks went so-called okay, and then some of the talks were like, we'll see what happens when that day comes. But no one, well, at least me, no one had any impression that it would be a siege or a riot or whatever you want to call it, because that was a total shock to me and a whole lot of people.
When things begin, it's hard to stop. You can't go backward.
It's just true. And the way it happened, it was, I don't know, it just seems like various groups of people had combined together, and it took over L Block.
And so let's go to that day. I think it was April 11th. Where were you?
Yes.
How did you first learn of the siege? And just kind of like take us back to that time.
Okay, I was in L1. I'll give you a mental picture. When you come down the L Block, L side, you come through a lock cage, a lock barrier gate. And on one side is L1, and L8 is across the hallway, and it goes all the way down. From L1, on that same side is L2, 3, and 4, and from 8, you go to 7, 6, and 5. But I was in the block. Matter of fact, I was in my cell, and all of a sudden I heard the guard telling everybody to lock it up, the guys that were in the day room. And people didn't know I didn't know what was going on. They said, everybody lock it up. So the guard locked it up. Everybody got locked up. And then all of a sudden, I'm looking out my cell door as much as I can. And I've seen a lot of guards, and one of the guards in our block, because there's normally two guards to a block. The guards were running down the hall toward L4 and L5, which means that yard is down in that direction. And as they were going down, I mean, it was a mass of them. But as soon as they were going down, they were coming back, and they looked like they had went through a meat grinder, And so I guess they ran in. I'm assuming they ran into an attack, and they were beaten down, and they were running for their lives. So they were running, trying to get through the crash gate, and the ones that made it through, but the ones that did not make it, they were confined with the guards that were left in the block. And at that weekend, it was a pretty light guard shift. And I don't think if it was a heavy guard shift, it would have meant any different, because it seems like the guys were serious about taking over L1. And that's how it started. And next thing I look around, when my block was the last one to get opened up, and there were guys out in the hallway, and everybody had, well, not everybody, but different people had commandeered different blocks. And, and that's how it went down. And first people were concerned if it was racial, and everybody seen that it wasn't racial because no one was singling out blacks or whites. And then it got to be known that sect of Muslims, Aryan Nations, and another group called the Gangsters Disciples or something like that. I never heard of these guys before. But these groups got together, the three main groups, and they controlled the atmosphere for the next 10 days.
I'm curious about that idea of like the representation, because those are the names that you hear. You hear about the Muslims, the Aryan Brotherhood, and the Black Gangster Disciples. But I assume that there were a lot of people, who weren't necessarily affiliated with any of those three groups. And yet those three groups became kind of almost like a governance system. I mean, they were the ones who were kind of organizing the daily activities, seemingly, and they were helping to formulate the demands and negotiate with the state. So I'm curious about like your perception of that as a leadership group.
Like you said, yes, there were a lot of people that were not affiliated with any of those three major groups. But the thing about the three major groups is that they made sure that everyone had something to eat, change of clothes, and they were trying to restore the electricity and the water. And we were asking for, they were asking, we were asking, all of us wanted some food. And to at least, bring us sandwiches at least once or twice a day and some water. And so those were major demands at first. But this is what they did throughout the proceedings. They cut our power off so we couldn't communicate with the loudspeakers that were set up. Then they didn't want us to address the media. None of us. Those guys that were in control, or even us inmates that were in the hallway. So what inmates started to do was write their demands and what was on inside these walls on sheets and hanging them outside the window. And that's how the media got to understand what was really going on when they, put the whole thing on silent. And I have to say this, those three groups did govern the inside very well, because it was over 400 inmates in the hallway itself. There were guys that were in the gym, and there were guys in each of the 8 blocks. But no one got singled out for doing anything crazy. And if you did, we found that if an inmate did something wrong to another inmate during those 10 days, they got sent to one of these main three groups, and they got locked up. No one got beat down. They just got locked up and separated. And even they had a group that was separated because they said some things that was against what they were doing. So they locked them up for their own protection.
And in the early days, there were 6 folks who were killed in their cells, weren't there? Yes,
there were. Allegedly, this happened the first day. And we saw some bodies being carried out the first day. And we didn't know whose body they were, if they were inmates or guards. But I think thereafter 3 days, maybe 4 days, another body was carried out. And we heard over the radio whose it was. It was a guard. And this was one of the guards that was pretty well liked by some of the inmates, and especially in my block, because he was my block officer, John Valenian. And they were, it was a kind of push and pull, because another announcement had came out about the Department of Corrections not listening to inmates and not adhering to them. And this woman came on as a representative of the the prison department, and she said that inmates just talk a lot of stuff. They're always threatening to do this, threatening to do that. They won't do anything. So I think her words caused them to send that body of that CO out like that.
Because the guard was bargaining power and they had to show that they were serious?
Well, they were trying, we had, like I said, we had radio, and they were trying to get one or more guards released every day. If they give us food, release a guard. If they give us water, release a guard. You see what I'm saying? So I think what the governing bodies realized that if they keep continuing to do like that, they won't have nothing to negotiate with. So this woman from the department said something to the effect that I just said, that they always saying they're going to do this and they're going to do that, because the threat came up that they will send a body out, a guard's body out. And she said, well, they're always talking like that. And that's what happened. They sent a guard's body out, and they really started to want to go through negotiations seriously. And it took that, I think, for them people to realize that the governing body were not playing around. They were getting tired, and it was cold, and they wanted to resolve the whole thing, because I don't think anybody had planned on going 10 days. I don't think it planned on going more than a day. What's important, I think, for people to understand about the siege is that throughout the whole state of Ohio, they locked down the whole penal system because they didn't want any more takeovers during those 10 days or thereafter. What inmates started to realize then was that if paperwork wasn't enough, we have to go to the administration and forcibly let them see that they were serious. And this is a serious situation at Riot, because it showed that the inmate body were unified enough to come together for what they call a common cause and make some results happen. I'll say this too. It brought about awakening throughout the penal system. But that awakening caused a lot of conflict on the guys that were there and got pointed out for stuff that they really didn't do. Like, some guys were doing things and they were taking themselves out of the criminal action and pointing somebody else. And the guys that were in charge of the governing bodies, like George Gates, Jason Robb, Hassan, Namir, and they had another guy named Keith Lamar. They got death row, whereas the other inmates got criminal charges. And the other inmates that did not get criminal charges got institutional charges, like myself. So they maxed me out. In other words, they made me do 19 years in isolation, and then do a year in prison population to max out. But we have inmates that have life, and they'll never get out. No one has been paroled.
Did you serve out the rest of those years at Lucasville, or were you transferred?
No. When the siege was over, L-side had to all come out on the yard in small groups, and there were options. You can go to another institution or wait it out here and eventually go to another institution. So it was about 129 of us that opted out to go to Mansfield on 3 buses. And we bounced from Mansfield to Lebanon, and from Lebanon, once OSP in Youngstown was built, I was the first one in there, me and 5 other guys, in 1998.
Into the Supermax?
Yes, that's what Supermax. They call it Ohio State Prison, Supermax. The weird part about it is a 500-bed institution. And they said it's for 500 of the worst inmates in the Ohio prison system. They did not have 500 inmates of the worst of the worst. They only had us so-called rioters. And they filled the other beds with people that were under severe medication. And and it was a sad thing to put people like that in isolation cells. But anyway, we got together and we tried to close it down, but we won the lawsuit, but we lost it. We didn't close the institution down, but it got changed from a Supermax to a High Max, and which means level 4, level 5. and they got rid of the psychotic medication people. When we got shipped to Mansfield, Nicky Schwartz had 9 public defenders come to Mansfield and talk to us and tell us and advise us that we can take our 5th. So I and 5 other inmates said that we can take our 5th, we can refuse to go out there. And they said, that's even better. So we spread the word around. And it wound up being 12 of us that refused to go out there, because what they did, once you go out to see these investigators, they had these pictures spread it out of the guys they wanted. And they were telling these guys, if you don't tell us what we want to know about this guy, we're going to charge you with this murder. And of course, guys didn't want to get charged with that murder. And they were pointing out this and saying that, and, telling a lot of fabricated lies. And some guys that were involved in murders took themselves out and pointed the fingers at other guys. Now, check this out. They said that 19 inmates killed that one guard.
What does that mean to you?
It says that they were drumming up the cases. They were piling on stuff for convictions. And see, as long as they were getting convictions, they were doing good. But once they lost the case, oh, wow, they said, well, we can't keep going with these old weak witnesses that we program. So they had to break it down and say, well, we just want to get these so-called leaders and their so-called good men, right men, and the rest of them, we're going to give them institution charges. But they got a lot of guys with a lot of prison cases.
So it sounds like the goal on the part of the administration was not to actually identify the people who had, in fact, hurt people during the siege, but actually just to engage in retaliation and punish anyone who dared to rise up.
Exactly. It was all about a vendetta. You tore up our institutions. You had us on camera for 10 days and this, that, and the other thing. So it was a personal vendetta. And it was personal. I know it was personal against me because I and other guys refused to even go out to see these investigators. So they say, yeah, we're going to lock him up. We're going to charge him with complicity. Now, there's one guy named Lou Jones. He admitted that he was with the death squad and killed 1 or 2 of those 5 or 6 inmates. Nevertheless, he pointed out other guys, and they did not charge him. What they did, they released him early on his original charge of murder and released him on the so-called murder that he admitted to in the uprising, just to get other guys. But like I said, it was all about a vendetta. We don't care who or how many it is. We want some bodies in front of us to get convicted. And we want these other guys that we feel are great leaders or hard leaders or that can motivate people. We want them on death row. So it's in essence, what they were doing is cut off the head and kill the body.
Join us for Kite-line, a weekly radio program on Channel Zero Network that focuses on issues in the prison system. With over 50 episodes already released, you can hear informative and riveting stories about the impact of prisons on people both inside and outside of the prison walls and how they fight back.
Kite-line is intended as means of communication between people across prison walls. Our goal at Kite-line is to amplify the voices of those within the prison system while encouraging dialogue with those on the outside.
Hear us on the Channel Zero Network and visit our website for more information or previous episodes at kitelineradio.noblogs.org.
And that is the 5 folks that you mentioned earlier then become the Lucasville 5, as they're often called.
Exactly, yes.
Do you think that any of the grievances that ended up being included in the 21 points for improvement of conditions, do you think that any of those things improved?
Only a few. The 21 points of agreement was violated. Some aspects of it were upheld, but then other aspects of it were kind of washed over. And today, a lot of these inmates don't even know what the 21-point agreement is. Very few of them remember anything about Lucasville. But the ones that did know about it, they were always flocking to the inmates that were involved in it. And some of these inmates were acting like legends, whereas I was totally different. They didn't even know I was involved in Lucasville siege. Well, not involved in it, but in the Lucasville siege. You see what I'm saying?
Were you glad to keep it that way?
Yes. Because every institution I went to, when I was released from OXP, I went to Toledo. They took me to the officer's office, and the captain and all these other guys told me, we know who you are. If anything happens, this is going to happen to you. So when I got released from there from a level 4 to a level 3, the same thing happened again. They pulled me into the captain's office and said the same thing. When I got released from level 3 to level 2, the same thing happened again. And these are I went to 4 different institutions in my 1 year, on my final year. But every institution I went to, they let me know that we know that you were in the 1993 Lucasville siege, and we got our eyes on you.
Whenever we stand against the flow of opinion on strongly contested issues, a man does what he must, in spite of personal consequences, in spite of obstacles, dangers, and pressures. That is the basis of all human morality.
Nicky, thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome.
I guess if we could just start by kind of picking apart Lucasville and what happened there.
The riot began on Easter Sunday, 1993. 1 week later, the prisoners still controlled half of the prison and still held 5 of the 9 hostages originally taken, 3 of them having been given back and 1 of them killed in the intervening week. And on the Sunday morning, 1 week into the riot, I got a call from the chief counsel of the Department of Corrections apprising me of the fact that they were in negotiations to settle the riot, that they had made some progress, but that they had reached an impasse, and that prisoners had demanded a lawyer, and they decided they wanted to give them one, and would like it to be me if I were willing to do that. I met with the law enforcement representatives and leadership in the warden's office, which was my introduction to it. So that's how I became involved initially. And I did not know, nor did I ask, what happened in the week preceding my arrival.
One of the major roles that I understand that you played was to help move the prisoner demands, which existed in a number of different forms, into what became the 21-point plan that was eventually agreed upon as part of the negotiated surrender. Perhaps that you might be able to reflect on what the process of turning those demands into that 21-point plan looked like.
When I was in the warden's office and introduced to all of the law enforcement participants, they explained to me what it was they wanted me to do. And although I was to act as counsel for the prisoners in some respects, they wanted to differentiate that role from what one would ordinarily expect a lawyer to do, because they gave me their 21-point response to the demands, wanted me to take it out to the prisoners that I was going to be meeting with and answer any questions they had, but did not want me to negotiate to improve the deal. And so I was simply handed what ultimately became the 21-point agreement, and I was the one who delivered it to the prisoner representatives and answered their questions and discussed it with them. But I was not consulted, nor did I really participate in the formulation of the state's response to them, other than to have some discussion with the state representatives when I saw this document, and I raised 3 or 4 questions, which I sought their their answer. One was that it was in large part pretty vague, and, did they intend to comply with the spirit of it and not just the letter? And they said yes. And I said, you realize that this having been extracted while they're holding hostages, that once you get the hostages back, you're free to repudiate it and have no obligation to comply with it. Is that what you intend to do? Because if so, I don't want any part of this. They said, no, we're committed to doing these things. A lot of them are things we should have been doing anyway. And so they gave me their word that they would comply with it, even though it wasn't legally binding because it was agreed to while the prisoners were holding hostages. I will tell you that at times in the aftermath of the riot, when I became frustrated with what I thought was resistance to compliance, I toyed with the idea of filing some kind of action to compel compliance with the points. Although it wasn't legally binding in favor of the prisoners who were holding hostages, there was a good argument that it might be legally binding when sought to be invoked by me, since I had been induced to participate in this thing by representations made to me by the state representatives, state and federal representatives, that they intended to and would comply.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I wonder if we could take a step back and focus in on some of what these demands and these points of agreement were, and especially focusing on the ones that, as you mentioned, you felt that there was some resistance to compliance on the part of the state?
Well, there were, of the 21 points, the ones that proved most problematic in the aftermath was point 2, which provided that administrative discipline and criminal proceedings will be fairly and impartially administered without bias against individuals or groups. And there's a serious question about the fairness of the criminal proceedings. Point 14, there will be no retaliating actions taken toward any inmate or groups of inmates or their property. I was recipient of multitudinous complaints about retaliation, and those were all issues that I spent an enormous amount of time and energy considering and discussing with various representatives of state and federal governments. Another one that on which there was resistance, original resistance, but ultimate compliance in a way, was point 21, that indicated that to the extent that they were unable to protect prisoners from retaliation by Ohio staff, guards, prison, etc., that they would have the opportunity or the option of getting a transfer to other states or federal prisons. That was one that ultimately the state was not happy to comply with, and in fact the only one they ever suggested they might not, as opposed to arguing with me about what was required. They ultimately created a process for evaluating inmates who were requesting transfer, in which I think it was designed to talk as many of them out of it as possible. But in the final analysis, those prisoners who hung in there and said, no, I want to be transferred, they ultimately complied with it and they got transferred. There are some issues with some of the other ones, but those are the three that come to mind as the most significant.
Well, that's interesting, because those are 3 points that really speak directly to the experience of people who rose up and what happened to them afterwards in terms of retaliation. So clearly those individuals who were targeted in various ways for their role met with a lot of repression and violence. But the rest of the points, most of the points, had to do with grievances that were pre-existing, that actually, were, I think what most people would agree, were the underlying causes of the rebellion in the first place. And so I'm wondering if you could reflect on some of those grievances that had to do with kind of setting the stage for what a lot of people described as, a powder keg and a pressure cooker and, a tinderbox, just all this kind of imagery of this was a situation that was waiting to boil over.
Some of them were improved. I mean, among the conditions you're talking about that created the tinder that a spark ultimately set off the rebellion, some of those things were addressed in the aftermath, some with greater positive consequence than others. Two of the things that were most contributory were overcrowding. You had cells that were built for one, being double-celled, double occupants, that had gone to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled that they could put two inmates into cells designed for one. So that was overcrowding. That resulted in overcrowding, and basically you're talking about putting two prisoners in a very small bathroom, which is what the cell resembled. Loving spouses would be at each other's throats within days. These weren't loving spouses. And the other thing was that the double celling created what the prisoners viewed as forced integration. In other words, instead of having the two prisoners in each cell be either both black or both white, the state, I think rightfully, concluded that kind of segregation and discrimination was unlawful, and so they put some white inmates in with there were some cells that were one white and one black, and that created racial tensions. The prisoners, not all of them, but many of them wanted that done away with. Well, the most positive thing that happened as a result of the riot, which addressed both of those issues, was to single-cell Lucasville, ultimately. And that reduced overcrowding tension, and it also reduced racial tension because with only one inmate per cell, you didn't have a forced integration problem. So that was the most positive corrective for underlying cause of the riot. In addition, another unhappiness that created the conditions that led to it were this prison had been built near the southern point of the state in a very rural and southern culture area, and it was thus staffed by southern and rural guards watching over black urban prisoners from the northern part of the state. And that was a recipe for disaster. But among other things, locating the prison where it was located meant that the families of the prisoners, it was inaccessible for families of prisoners to visit, and they had, no meaningful telephone privileges. I think they got one phone call a year or something. That was one of the great causes of unhappiness on the part of the inmates, which ultimately was, if not cured, ameliorated by putting in a phone system, still subject to the prison phone system problem of turning it over to private enterprise and making it more expensive than it needs to be. But nevertheless, it allowed for greater access of prisoners to their families by phone than had been the case prior to the riot.
It's interesting that you bring up the kind of forced integration in selling as one of the grievances, because once the rebellion got going, the people who were involved in the uprising made very explicit that it was not a race riot. It was not black against white or Muslim against Christian or anything like that. It was very clearly articulated as unity of incarcerated people against an administration that was victimizing everyone.
Well, that's very interesting because, although there were 407 prisoners in the L block, which is the half of the prison that was controlled by the prisoners, I only met with three of them, the three leaders of or three representatives of the three groups involved in the riot. And the three groups were the Black Gangster Disciples, the Sunni Muslims, and the White Aryan Brotherhood. And at one point, I observed to the three guys with whom I became increasingly more comfortable with as things proceeded, I observed that here you would expect the White Aryan Brotherhood and the Black Gangster Disciples to be at each other's throats, and yet they were working together harmoniously. And their response was interesting, that prison administrators try to maintain order by pitting groups against each other, and some of the younger, hot-headed prisoners fall for that, but the old hands know that's a divide-and-conquer tactic, so they had no problem working together, the White Aryan Brotherhood and the Black Gangster Disciples and the Sunni Muslims. That was a revelation to me.
You alluded to the fact that the prosecutions of these individuals and others afterwards bear the stamp of retaliation and perhaps not the stamp of justice, according to the legal system.
The guarantee or the promise of no retaliation wasn't an amnesty or a promise of no prosecution. In fact, one of my very first meeting with the three leaders, one of their first demands was amnesty, and I explained that was totally unrealistic. A guard had been killed. And in fact, one of the things I spent a lot of time doing was explaining each side's politics to the other, which I think was necessary to reaching some kind of understanding for each to understand the political problems that each side confronted, and the things that were realistic and things that were unrealistic. And so most of my negotiating, although they said they didn't want me to negotiate on their behalf, I said I reserved the right to negotiate if I felt it was essential to maintaining my relationship with them. Most of the negotiation that took place while I was there was about the terms and conditions of surrender, when and how it would take place, who would be observers, that it would be televised live, the entire surrender process, that the members of the three groups represented by the three negotiators would not spend 1 minute in a Lucasville cell after the end of this riot, after the surrender, but would be bused to other institutions that night, etc. So, there was no assurance that people weren't going to be prosecuted. Now, the issue of the fairness of the prosecutions is a long story, which I don't know if you have time for me to talk about it in great detail, but when you talk about retaliation against the leaders, there is basis to be concerned that they were targeted for capital charges, even though they didn't have any hands-on involvement in the killing of the guard, and that other prisoners were offered incentives to kind of put them in the soup. Those are concerns that have been addressed by Stoughton Lind in the book that he wrote about the subject. So that's a concern that I have about that.
But you did some work to help folks get access to counsel, is my understanding?
Yes. My initial concern was immediately after the riot that there would be interrogations of everybody and that they needed counsel for that. And I made arrangements with the law enforcement negotiator with whom I had developed the closest relationship, Tom Rice, the commander of the State Highway Patrol. I had a meeting with him in Columbus, explained why both sides would have an interest in these guys having lawyers, interim lawyers, before anybody got indicted, because in Ohio there's no right to appointment of counsel prior to indictment, and that both sides would have an interest in getting them counsel, one, because the prisoners should be advised of their rights and responsibilities and opportunities to minimize bad consequences. And the state, to the extent that it wanted to make deals with prisoners to get evidence, would have an interest in their having lawyers who could negotiate for the prisoners and make arrangements. So we had planned a meeting of various representatives That meeting never occurred because he called me a day or two later and said that the special prosecutor didn't want that meeting to take place. He didn't want the prisoners to have counsel because they would be less likely to incriminate themselves. And so he said no meeting. So barred from access to governmental entities to get them counsel, I turned to non-governmental entities in the form of the Ohio Public Defender, State Public Defender, the Ohio Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, and the Ohio State Bar Association. And through those entities, we managed to recruit over 200 lawyers who would agree to counsel an inmate as his counsel in the interim, then accept appointment to represent them in their case if and when a case developed. And we held training seminars for our recruits and assigned those prisoners who we thought were at greatest risk of prosecution, assigned them lawyers. The problem developed then when they started indicting some of them, and the Southern Ohio courts and special judges appointed to handle the cases refused to appoint the lawyers that we had recruited and those who had developed a good relationship with their client, which, as a result of which, I wrote a letter to the Chief Justice of the Ohio Supreme Court complaining about this, and in fact, the prosecutor had argued against their appointment unless they were going to plead him guilty, in which case he wanted them appointed. I detailed all this in a letter to the Chief Justice, who ultimately intervened to see that competent counsel who qualified, whom we had recruited and who had developed a relationship with their client, would be appointed if they wanted to be. There were problems in appointment of appellate counsel. The first case to go to trial was a prisoner who had a good trial lawyer, who, after his client was convicted, recommended 3 lawyers for appointment to handle the appeal, 3 very highly qualified criminal defense lawyers to handle the appeal, or the Franklin County Public Defender. Instead, the court appointed, this was a visiting judge in Franklin County, Columbus, the court appointed a Southern Ohio lawyer who had been admitted to practice less than 6 months and who filed a brief that failed to raise most of the issues that the trial lawyer thought were of concern. The Court of Appeals went ahead and affirmed the conviction on the grounds filed by the admitted for less than 6 months lawyer. It's ironic that we're talking about that today because I've been in contact with this prisoner ever since, and I'm about to file a request with the state parole board. This fellow's parole was denied in 2015, and he was flopped until 2025. That is, the board won't even consider him again until 2025. So I've filed a motion for them to reconsider that and hopefully grant him parole. I talked earlier about the best thing that I thought, the most positive thing that came out of the riot was the single selling of Lucasville in the aftermath. The worst thing that happened as a result of the riot was the state promptly embarked on building a new supermax in the Youngstown area that would emulate Pelican Bay in California. That is where you would supposedly take the worst of the worst and isolate them from all human contact. It's horribly inhuman kind of treatment. So Ohio, in the aftermath of Lucasville, and as a result, direct result of Lucasville, built such a place. And one of the problems is that it's sold on the ground. This terrible treatment is going to be reserved for the worst of the worst. But the problem is the worst of the worst keeps getting redefined because where you have an overcrowded prison system, they have to fill the bed. And so the worst of the worst keeps getting defined down in order to qualify them to go to this awful place.
Yeah, it just goes to show that whatever repressive power the state creates for itself, it will be used. So perhaps a good lesson to learn about creating those kinds of repressive apparatuses in the first place.
Well, I think prison riots are not the most constructive way of dealing with these problems, but they, in a sense, if you don't pay attention to the problems and conditions and so forth, that's the risk that's created. Interesting fact, the previous big prison riot in Ohio took place at the old Ohio State Penitentiary in Columbus in 1968. And that was a prison that was replaced by Lucasville. So it's ironic that the Lucasville prison riot occurred 25 years after the one at the old Ohio State Penitentiary in Columbus. Well, we're now coming up on 25 years from the Lucasville prison riot. I'm not predicting another riot, but it's just an ironic and interesting fact.
And now some announcements. Here's a quick update about the court process for Herman Bell. The hearing began around 3 p.m. The judge relayed at the outset that he did not plan to issue a decision today, and that the temporary restraining order would remain and not be lifted until the decision was rendered. The judge also asked that the hearing be focused primarily on standing. The question is whether a member of the victim's family, Diane Piagentini, has, quote, standing, unquote, in the court and in this case. Without standing, the case cannot go forward, the case that's holding off Herman Bell's release. Each side then had around 10 minutes to give their arguments on that issue, which they did. Again, no decision was rendered, and there wasn't much indication of how the judge would rule. The judge did say that he understood the urgency of the case and that Herman's liberty was at issue, and that he would begin making determinations on Monday, April 16th. In another announcement, the folks who are organizing the Worldwide Day of Action in solidarity with Marius Mason and all long-term anarchist prisoners have released their announcement for the scope and prisoners, including ones in Germany, Chile, Greece, and the U.S., who they are supporting, alongside a message for this year. We're just going to excerpt the very end of the call-up here, and you can find the whole thing up at june11.noblogs.org. Quote, June 11th is an idea, not just a day. June 11th is every day, and ideas are bulletproof. Let's breathe life into the rest of the year and renew the celebration of anarchist prisoners' lives by carrying on their struggles alongside them. In short, it's a call-out, so we're calling on you. June 11th is what you make of it. Follow your heart and fill the world with beautiful gestures. There is no action too small or too grand.
This is from an official press release which came out this morning regarding continuing activity concerning ICE raids in Asheville, North Carolina. News began to arrive early this morning that ICE was continuing their activity throughout Buncombe County. Local organizers have been monitoring unmarked vehicles that have been driving through West Asheville neighborhoods and the surrounding areas. Due to these mobilization efforts, no one has been detained. SEMA and the WNC Sanctuary Movement encourage community members who fear for their safety to remember your rights. You may refuse to open your door or let ICE agents in unless the agent has a warrant signed by a judge. If they have a warrant, you may ask for them to slide it under the door, and it must have both your correct legal name on it as well as your correct address in order for it to be valid. Only a court and/or judge warrant is enough to enter your premises. Do not lie or show false documents, and do not sign any papers without speaking to a lawyer. You may also ask for an interpreter. Consider coming out and supporting members of affected communities this evening at the Catholic Charities Diocese of Charlotte's Immigration Forum, For You Were Once a Stranger in the Land of Egypt, Immigration, Why We Care and What We Can Do. The forum is being held this afternoon, April the 15th at 5 p.m. at St. Eugene Catholic Church. Mayor Esther Mannheimer and Sheriff Van Duncan are invited to attend. Come voice your concern about ICE ripping families apart in our community. Your support is appreciated, and for more information, you can follow SEMA, Compañeros Inmigrantes de las Montañas en Acción, and Nuestro Centro Facebook pages online. If you have any information which would contribute to helping keep affected communities safer in the Asheville area, the hotline to call is 1-888-839-2839. Please make sure that the information you have is both verified and up to date if you call this number.
If anyone feels like making a donation of $1 to infinity, you can visit patreon.com/TFS, and there's some thank you gifts up on there. That's for recurring donations. If you feel like donating to the show on just a one-time thing, you can go and send us money via PayPal if you want. And there should be links up on our website for that. But you can hit up thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net as the address you can send money to. And if you see anything up on our Patreon, stickers or t-shirts or whatever, that you're interested in, then just hit us up an email if you can't make a regular donation. Thank you very much. Bye.